Hello everyone, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. I thought I would mix this one in here since it's been a while since I've done a video for this particular playlist. I still see a lot of people watching my Mafia and Gangsters videos, so this is definitely a treat for those of you fans out there. As always, I like to feature those mafiosos who are lesser known, those that have passed through history in the world of the mafia. Nobody remembers them to this day. I like featuring them because, again, they're associated with all that history, and such is the case with this gangster that you're looking at here. In fact, he was someone that was part of Al Capone's infamous Chicago-based criminal organization, and in fact, he was almost up there at the very top, if but for the fact some other members did not agree to him becoming the new leader. More on that here in just a moment. But again, you're looking at him now. His name is Franklin Rio, but he goes by various names. As always, the world of mafia, there's nicknames. He was known as Frank Rio and also known as Frank Klein. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to call him Frank Rio. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating info associated with this gangster, see about his history, and then ultimately see what happened to him afterwards. So here's what happened. Like most early mafioso gangsters, he was born outside the country. In fact, he was born in Oliveto, Sitra, Italy, back on July 2nd, 1895. So just at the turn, almost at the turn of the century itself. His parents were named Antonio and Rosa Costa Rio. And in fact, much little history is known about his earliest days, like his childhood and anything else associated with his teenage years. But ultimately, he ended up marrying a lady by the name of Anna Chappell sometime in the mid-1910s, and then they had a child afterward. This was a child by the name of Lawrence, who was born in 1922. Now again, not much history is known about his very early age, but sometime later on he did move over to the United States, and he ended up having a very early life involving crime. In fact, this crime included stuff such as automobile theft, burglary, and even robbery. And even though he was arrested several times over, including items associated with holdups, he never really was convicted on multiple occasions. Here's what I mean on this. In September 1918, he was there in Maywood, Illinois, and he ended up robbing a bank that was located there. But even though he robbed it, he was ultimately never ever convicted. Cut to the next year, 1919, November 10 to be specific, and he was arrested when police caught him trying to steal some stolen furs over onto a vehicle. I don't know how they found him. Maybe something was tipped off. Maybe they in turn, the stolen vehicle was flagged by police officers, something along those lines. But either way, nothing ultimately happened to him. And then cut to another 2 years afterwards, him along with two other associates, one by the name of Robert O'Neill, the other one by the name of Thomas Dyer, actually stepped things up. They ended up going to Chicago's famous Union Station, and they ended up robbing a mail train. Can you believe that? So now they ended up basically taking things to a whole other level, trying to steal something associated with mail train, or a train that had a bunch of mail in it. They were actually looking for bonds, and they ended up stealing bonds that ended up being $482,000. Now this is very huge, much bigger than any of the other robberies that he had been in. In fact, I went to the inflation calculator, and it stated that at that year, $482,000 was just under $8.5 million. Can you believe that? That must have been one of the biggest, if not the biggest, theft associated in American history, at least at that time. And then even though this happened during the daytime, and even though he was later caught afterwards, him and the other associates, I believe, were never ever taken to trial. In fact, all the charges ended up being dropped. Talk about a lucky guy, right? But as it turns out, money definitely still had an influence back then, as it does now, because he was able to get away with it by essentially bribing judges, intimidating other people, and then also making sure that certain witnesses were murdered. So if you happen to be there at the wrong place at the wrong time, like let's say you happen to see him and his associates doing this robbing of that mail train, That was very bad luck for you because, as it turns out, you could have ended up being murdered by him or some of his associates to make sure that nothing happened to him afterwards. He ended up getting a nickname because of his elusiveness, because of the way he was able to escape all of these convictions. They ended up calling him Slippery Frank Rio, all these times that he was able to essentially evade trial. And then if you wanted to see where his life took a next turn, it definitely took another bigger step because he ended up working for the Chicago outfit. This happened because the most infamous gangster of all, Al Capone himself, ended up catching the attention of, or ended up seeing like having the attention caught of Frank Rio. So Frank Rio came within his sights, and then he ended up working for Al Capone, and then Capone himself ended up having him become one of his top enforcers, one of his top associates there within his outfit. He was intensely loyal to Capone as well. Anything and everything having to do with the business itself, any other type of business needs, even personal needs associated with Al Capone, he made sure to take care of. He also became a personal bodyguard for Al Capone, and he was considered one of his quote unquote golden boys. So even though Capone had a bunch of henchmen within his Chicago outfit, this guy Frank Rio, definitely rose to the top. In fact, he became one of the most valuable ones associated with it, not just because of his exploits, not just because of his expertise and the way he was able to make all this ill-gotten money, but also because he ended up literally saving Capone's life at a certain point. For example, there was a hit that was being ordered by a guy by the name of Earl Jaime Wise over to Capone, and I guess Frank Rio must have caught it just at the right moment because he threw Al Capone over to the ground, and he ended up essentially missing this whatever the hit was. So Al Capone's life was saved literally by Frank Rio. And then not only that, but there were other attempted hits as well to Al Capone. One was a plot by Albert Anselmi, another one by John Scalise, and another one by Joseph Guinta. And this was as a way to try to take over everything associated with the Chicago outfit. But Frank Rio was essentially able to stop that. I don't have the details exactly of what occurred. Maybe he stopped it ahead of time. Maybe he heard some information and then intimidated or ensured that others were taken care of before anything like this occurred to Al Capone. But you can see why Capone essentially had him as one of his most trusted advisors. He was definitely there taking care of business, and he was saving the life of his boss. And he was doing this on a very close and personal level that he became one of his trusted golden boys. So much so, in fact, that at the infamous Atlantic City Conference that occurred in 1929, Frank Rio was there also in attendance. And then at a certain point, Capone got so paranoid about all these numerous hiring, murder for hire rackets that were going after him just time after time, that he wanted to make sure that when he got put in jail, that Rio was also there, that Frank Rio was there with him to protect him. And then that way, nothing else would happen to him, even in jail in of itself. So definitely a unique set of circumstances when it comes to Frank Rio, going from stealing certain vehicles, furs, other items, those large bonds that I was mentioning earlier, to then becoming a member of Al Capone's Chicago outfit, and then finally becoming one of his most trusted confidants and employees there. Definitely a unique set of circumstances for Frank Rio. Now, this next bit of info was definitely interesting to me because everyone knows that Al Capone escaped a lot of convictions in a similar way, just like Frank Rio. Like, a lot of things were thrown at Capone, but he potentially was able to get off. And we all know that there was a lot of unique circumstances involving bribery and intimidation and so on. But one thing that ended up taking Al Capone down, of course, was the infamous tax case, the tax evasion charges that were tied to him. Well, Frank Rio, when this was happening at that time, knew about this, knew about the seriousness associated with tax evasion, and he was telling Al Capone about this. He was telling him back in 1931, this is a serious matter. You can actually be convicted and be sent to jail. And he wanted to let him know during that time period to not take this as a joke, to essentially take this with the serious matter that it definitely allows, like that you have to take it into that consideration. Well, Capone didn't end up listening to Frank Rio, even though he had him as a close confidant. And we all know what happened next. He was convicted, he was charged, he was sent to federal prison. Well, this ended up becoming a situation, a unique one as well for Frank Rio, because now that Capone was gone, now that he was in federal prison, who was going to be the leader at that point? A lot of people there considered Frank to be actually the successor, to be the next in line when it came to running the outfit. But as it turns out, and again, this is another unique twist in the terms of the world of the mafia, there were other high-level mobsters within that same organization who thought otherwise. They thought that even though he was a good soldier and he was someone that was a good confidant, somebody that was able to do what's needed and obviously be trusted and so on, he had what they considered too little leadership experience. Also, some people were stating that Frank Rio, even though he made his bones, if you will, like a lot of his actions in his younger years and the way that he was using that to rise to the top. But once he was there next to Capone, a lot of people there within the organization thought that he had gone too quote unquote soft, that he had too many years in quote unquote high living, and he was basically out of touch with the other mafioso members there. And so they thought that this included him not becoming a good leader because of it. So as it turns out, he was eventually passed over. And then there was another guy, Frank Nitti, who ended up becoming the actual leader associated with that Chicago outfit. It got me wondering, can somebody be essentially too good in their role that they don't want whoever else is trying to ensure that they don't move that person from that role, that it hinders that person from doing so? Like, in other words, they don't get promoted to the next position, something along those lines. Made me wonder, you see that sometimes in the business world where someone is too good in their role that they don't get promoted to another area. That it looks like in the mafia, that's what happens too. Now, if you wondered what occurred to Frank Rio shortly after that, he ended up staying with the mafia, like essentially a lifelong member, but he ended up having a very short life. In fact, this is what happened next. His associations, his links, everything, his power that he had just slowly ended up dwindling over the next several years. The new becomes the old, right? New people come in and they in turn want to have their power. So cut to about 1932 and he was sent over to New Jersey to offer some assistance when it comes to Charles Lindbergh and actually his kidnapped baby son. Can you believe that? But it was refused. And then shortly after that, he ended up having very poor health. His health ended up deteriorating more and more. In fact, he ended up having a heart disease that ended up being so bad that he had shortness of breath, physical weakness. I don't know if this was tied to anything else, like activities, like if he was a heavy smoker or otherwise was in a situation where he just had a very, very bad diet, anything like that, or if it was just genetics, who knows? Or maybe it was even something along the lines of being in a high stress position like he had there, but it ended up claiming his life. In fact, by the end of his life in 1933, he rarely left his home because of all the illnesses that he had at that time. And so from it in 1935, he ended up dying. February 23rd at noon, to be specific, 1935, that's when he ended up passing away. The official cause of death, coronary occlusion, including a heart attack, which ended up basically killing him right then and there. So once that happened, he did have a big burial because of his prominence, because of his position associated within the mafia. It was said, though, that his burial was really, really quick, that the mafioso members there wanted to make sure that this was done before any news of his death hit other locations because they wanted to divide up all of his assets. He did have a bunch of interests, financial interests in cafes, casinos, and nightclubs. So once this occurred, once his death happened, then they made sure that they were easily able to carve it up for themselves. And then another interesting twist, even though he was Roman Catholic, he was denied a church funeral. So his actual funeral ended up happening there at his wherever the local undertakers were. That's when the priest was able to say his prayers there. And then that's when, of course, he had his funeral. Otherwise, in another large area, there were several hundred cars that were there too, including mourners and others bringing the usual type of funeral flowers and so on. This is his actual grave that you're looking at here. It's located in Hillside, Illinois, there in Mount Carmel Cemetery. He ended up dying again in 1935 at the young age of 39. So he ended up being in the mafia at a young age, and he ended up dying at a young age as well. But in the meantime, he was able to rise up within the Chicago outfit, almost to the point, again, where he became that close to leading Capone's outfit. He was that close, but so close, so far, he just never actually made it. So interesting stuff. But if you wanted to go to that cemetery, you can definitely see his position there, like his actual cemetery plot right there. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. One other bit of info when it comes to trivia: he was portrayed in the 2017 film Gangsterland. So if you wanted to see a film depiction of him there, well, he's basically within that film. So otherwise, if anything else might have missed, anything else that's needed for his life that should be included, please post them in the comments below. All right, everyone. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.